Hello and welcome to Lit Illuminated. I'm so excited to have you here with me today. This is a space where we talk about books, not only how they help us connect to ourselves, but how they help us connect to the world around us. And today we have a special guest. I'm so excited to welcome Millie Tullis with us here today to talk about her latest book, These Saints Are Stones. So I'm so excited to dive into this. So welcome, Millie.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'm so excited to talk to you.
Yeah. And as always, I just want to dive right in to some questions. I have a bunch of questions. I love the ancestral lines that you talk about in this space, and you're kind of searching in this way. And I love looking at the ways that authors incorporate research into the work and how they're gathering information, and then they produce this work out of that information. So it sounds like there was some uncovered information about your ancestors as you were bringing this project together. So can you talk about that? What was that like, the research process?
Yeah, so this project really began in my MFA, and one of the most valuable things I learned in my MFA is that I often feel really creative and productive and driven when I have like a research question and bug that I'm working on. And I, in my undergrad, had mostly kind of taken nonfiction classes and written nonfiction, and like I knew I loved that. And reading a little bit more widely in my MFA, I realized that there are also a lot of poets who use and do interesting things with research and historical research or family research. And so I was really, I think, like learning that about myself was helpful, that I could be doing a lot of research as a poet and with the intention to write poetry out of it. Um, and like the older sort of germ of the research in this book, I think, is just that I grew up hearing a lot of family stories, and especially like a lot of family pioneer stories. My mom was is a really good storyteller and did a lot of family research. And in general, like Mormons really value family research and knowing a little bit about your ancestors and knowing like tracking down names and stuff. So actually a lot of that work also was there for me. Like when I started doing this, like I had access to, on the one hand, sort of a lot of information, and on the other hand, not as much information as I wanted, because it was generally not really about the women. But yeah, I knew that I had a lot of Mormon pioneer ancestors kind of on all branches of my family tree, and I knew that there was polygamy, but like that wasn't as much talked about. Like, those weren't family stories that were like really, people didn't want to talk about polygamy as much as other kinds of pioneer stories. But I knew anecdotally that I had somebody in my family line had married a mother and then married her daughter and been married to both at the same time. And just that like fact always, like I didn't forget that, like that always really bothered me. And it took a while for me to kind of rip off the band-aid and try to go looking for information specifically about those women. Yeah, so I can talk a lot about research, but yeah, I think especially kind of archival like scraps and looking for things that are women's history and stuff is often just harder to find. Like you have to think more creatively, or you have to value oral histories, in a different way. And a lot of family history and knowledge I had was through oral storytelling and stuff. Like there is other kinds of documentation, but a lot of stories about my great great grandmother or whatever is because somebody told a family story to somebody else who told it, and so there's also a lot of that is also kind of an important source in the book, the things that I grew up hearing.
Yeah, I love how you incorporated the research in it, and you're kind of that knowing of yourself as a writer, that often having that little bug, like, as you mentioned, like pulls you into it. And so I'm so interested when you mentioned too that originally you work in nonfiction a lot, but then you kind of went with poetry in this space. So what was it like kind of taking that historical research and using poetry as the methodology? And like, can you share a little bit about that shift and what that was like?
Yeah, so I did also write poetry early on, but I think that something I love about poetry And I do love prose too, and I read a lot of prose. Something I love about poetry then and now is that I can squeeze it into my life in different ways. I find that I take a really, really long time to edit prose. And yeah, like there's other even ideas and things that I would like to write, but I just don't, I haven't been good about making the kind of time I would need to do longer prose projects. Even, I mean, and by longer, I even just mean like an essay. Like an essay can take me forever. And a poem can take me forever too. Like, you know, there are poems that I've edited for a really, really long time off and on, but you can kind of pop into a poem or throw down a draft of a poem. You know, I don't know. I think also just conceptually, most of my poems are uh, not really, really long. So I also just really enjoy editing something when you can see it all at once. But with this specific project, like I think something that was, it's hard for me to imagine like the same research question and project and task taking on a different form just because from the beginning it was poetry, but it, like logically I know I could have like there it could that this also could have been a really interesting essay or you know and it would have been just totally different. But this really started with one the first poem in this book that I wrote was like a dream poem. And I don't know that I would have written that if I wasn't taking this one specific class that was called Poetics of Wandering and had kind of weird assignments and got me sort of thinking outside of just trying things that I normally kind of wouldn't try. Because writing a dream poem for somebody who died 100 years ago isn't something I had done with research or ancestors or anything before. And that poem just, I ended up actually feeling really interesting. And it also just felt like really rich territory that like I could keep digging into. And I had done a little bit of research. So there are some kind of glimmers of the historical in it, but it is very much like in the speculative realm. Um, and I think poetry just has so much flexibility to not answer everything and not to be unhelpful or but I just think like this is a project where ultimately I there's just a lot of things I can't know and don't get to know and there's a lot of silence and I think poetry let me not try to cover that up or back away from it. Poetry has a lot of room for those things and I also just think like structurally I really like that in a poem, you can kind of have the logic of a sentence and you can have the logic of a line and you can hold a couple of different kinds of meanings or readings like in your grammar at the same time. So I think that kind of flexibility and potential for not ambiguity in the sense that I think things are unclear, but just like ambiguity in the sense that there could um, be a lot of different truths in a thing. That's not inherent to poetry, but I feel like that's something that I like about poetry.
Yeah, and I love that he leaned into that idea of like it allows for the silence, because that was so felt
Mm,
through your work in this collection, and just kind of like allowing for those spaces, and then for those pauses. Poetry allows for pauses also in contemplation when you have those large breaks, or like you allow the reader to kind of sit in that space with you. So yeah, no, I love that you chose poetry to kind of work through these stories, and I think it was a brilliant way of doing that.
thanks.
So yeah, so I noticed that the book's divided into 5 sections, and we often talk about book structure on this podcast. So can you talk a little bit about your selection process as you were like, I have all these poems, now I'm putting it all together. Like, how did you figure out 5 sections? Was the number have meaning, or did it just turned out that way?
That is a good question because I putting together an or like sequencing a book felt like one of the hardest things for me and partly just because this is my first full length collection of poetry so I had not had that task before of but I knew it was a like I knew the project scope like was a book but even now I'm working on like a chapbook and I'm just like I think I'm still bad at this like I think I just because you're creating because it matters a lot like the when you obviously but when you read the pacing and connections you make the ordering just matters so much and there's so many different things it could be and I like this book in my brain has had so many forms and shapes that are all a little bit different. I originally also had some other, like right now it mainly focuses on um, Martha and Alice and David. That one, the anecdote I'd mentioned earlier, that he had married, David had married a widow who was older than him and named Alice, and then he also married her young teenage daughter and had children with both and lived all together. But so, like, there are also kind of personal poems in there. The middle section is sort of more about like a version of me in my childhood. But I originally had a lot of other kind of pioneer poems and ancestors and stories. And I think that something that I ended up really prioritizing with this structure is like I did feel like the content itself is kind of confusing. And I mean that in the sense that I think like I'm trying to imagine that sort of polygamous union is hard to do. And I don't feel like I really, I don't know what that would be like. There's limits, a lot of limits on how well I can even try to imagine what that would be like. So it's like confusing to just conceptualize, at least for me. But then it also is sort of confusing, like, um, I was writing this for sort of a general contemporary poetry reader who might have very little previous context that would be relevant to, like, this is like a very specific historical time and place and like cultural baggage and stuff. And so I felt like and then there's like dreams, and I was like, the thing itself is already sort of confusing. And so I tried to, in the structuring, minimize as much as possible, like, that potential for confusion. And I have sort of very clear buckets now of the way that the book ended up. The first section really lays out like that dynamic in marriage and the project of trying to learn about them and going to the cemetery. But it's very much sort of explaining how this marriage and dynamic sort of came to be with what we know, and part of why it's so troubling. And then the second section is very small. It's just a couple of epistolary poems. And I can talk more about that form later too if you want. And then the third section, which maybe is the biggest, is a little bit more like personal poems, but also sort of personal poems that are about, I think, kind of growing up as a young Mormon girl in the 90s and 2000s, and having like kind of the place that I was living, and also kind of the weight and interest in like women's work and labor, in my more like recent maternal histories, and kind of the contemporary weight of pioneer stories. And then the fourth section is actually an erasure of the second section. So I erased those letter poems. And then the fifth section is a lot of the dreams and goes back to part one and sort of continues part one's, not narrative, I guess, but sort of project two. But it's a little bit more speculative and imaginative, as her part one was pretty rooted in what I could know. Part five is a little bit more of things I can't know, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I was gonna follow up on section 4 because I love section 4. The form was fabulous, and I really kind of loved, again, that repeating, that kind of coming into the space. And I didn't fully make the connection that it, because you have some other repeats throughout, but like that was a beautiful.
And there's a lot of poems that use a lot of white space, but those are specifically, kind of marking, literally erasing and obliterating part of those letters from section 2. Yeah.
And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, section 4 was only untitled as well, right?
They like all have epigraphs. Oh yeah, section 4. Yeah. Those poems don't have titles.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Which I think is another, coming back to your previous statement about the silences that are allowed in poetry. I think that one really fascinated me, and I love that space. I'm open to whether you want to talk about 4 and that process, or 2, since you mentioned about coming back to that. So what was that like?
I can kind of talk about both because they are these little echoes of each other, I think, like in the book structure, but also visually and materially. Like you can so I wrote some epistolary poems because so something, I guess I should say, something I did not find in my research that I would have liked to have found was, like even just a piece of Martha or Alice's voice, like a piece of writing or a scrap of, you know, them saying something, them writing something. Alice couldn't write, but Martha could write. And I haven't ever found that. Like, I don't know what her handwriting looked like or anything. And like, I'm sure it was cursive, but you know, like that kind of human voice thing I never found. And but what's interesting is I actually have access to a lot of letters because David had gone on a mission to proselytize in Scotland, and he wrote home to his family a lot and they wrote back. But you know, he was always writing to his entire family. There's no letter directly to Martha, and Martha never was the one writing back. It was always one of the kids kind of writing for the whole family. And so these are kind of imaginary letters because there never was that direct communication in like the historical stuff we have. And so I kind of imagined the letters that they never would have written or could have written as poems. And then part 4 was also very much a way to, like, Erasure felt like a really appropriate form for the book because silence is so important. And so much I think about, like, I set out sort of to write thematically. I think about like gendered violence and sexual violence and women's history and Mormon culture and inheritance. And I ended up, one of the other things that I sort of found along the way that ended up being really important to me was gaps and silences, and being sort of an essential part of talking about women's history and all those other themes too. And so I think Erasure felt really appropriate to play with. There's literally the words almost look like literally like gaps on a white page, you know what I mean? Like, or they're like holes where something can poke through. And you can also, so I kind of exploded out like some of the erasures. I just put a bit of it on its own page. So they don't all line up perfectly, but like you can even put section 2 and 4 together and see like the words lining up across the pages of where they would be. And I think Erasure also felt helpful because the book is a little bit preoccupied with haunting and like secular haunting, maybe kind of. And I think that Erasure is always like kind of, it's already historical, it's already weighed down by that original text, and most, not all the time, but often Erasure, the context of where it's coming from is really important, you know, like the weightiness of that and the tension between those two different versions of itself existing. But there's also all these like ghosts of within Erasure of like other poems you could have written, you know, from that same text or document. Like there's all these other versions of things. Yeah. So
Yeah, that other layering, right? Like how life layers on life and like history layers on history and ancestors. Like I love all of that in that space in such a beautiful way to kind of the 2 and 4 like sitting in the middle essentially of all the other ones, which is start with the historical you, you know, it's just brilliant. You did, you mentioned you didn't have their handwriting and their quotes, but you did incorporate some quotes from your ancestors in here. So how did it feel like incorporating their words into your work?
yeah. So one example of like I have language like from David. Like David wrote letters and I have like his words, right? And like part 2, which is the first, which is the beginning of those letter poems, starts with an epigraph that's from him writing to back home to his family, and he would write dear wives and family. And then his first wife, the mother who was older than him, died while he was on his mission. And then when he writes home, it just says dear wife and family, you know, because there's no wives. And there's another epigraph that is Martha and David's daughter writing to David, and kind of talking about how her mother's doing, how Martha's doing. So I do have, yeah, like I found a lot of little bits of like information about them, but for my primary focus of what I wanted to know about was really Alice and Martha, and anything I found out about them was always at least one step removed, where it's someone else describing them or recalling them. or writing a history about them. And there's a poem that near the back of the book that talks about a neighbor they had who described Alice and Martha, and the Alice one's earlier, but there's somebody like a great aunt, I don't remember right now, of mine, had gone to Pinto, which was the small place that they lived, and interviewed one of their neighbors about Alice and Martha. That's an account where at that point she was a very old woman recalling decades before, in this very informal interview, and that actually felt like one of the most intimate glimpses at them. And even that, it's like, I don't know if they were super close with this neighbor, like, but it's like, because that neighbor was specifically talking about these women and what she remembered about these women, and then like the details she remembers are also kind of interesting and odd. Like Alice could do really intense math in her head and like remembered how much she paid in tithing and these kinds of things, and that Martha had like the first store-bought carpet in town, and like, like, so, and then when you have so little historical information, and you're looking really hard, it's like, it's interesting too how valuable those small glimmers are, but it's also just omnipresent that I don't know a lot of other facts about. Like, I don't know much about Martha's feelings or interior life, but I know that she had the first store-bought carpet, like, that's what I know. So you're both really grateful that you know that, and it's also very odd what we don't record or value or remember, too, just about historical figures and what we do keep.
A brief pause in programming to really offer my sincere thanks for you joining me here on the Lit Illuminated podcast, as well as all your support through likes and subscription and comments. It all matters for podcasts like this one. And I also just wanted to mention that Lit Illuminated is more than this podcast. There are other ways to get connected to literature and the way that it informs our lives. I offer workshops as well as MFA-like seminars. I do independent study as well as mentoring memoir writers. So if you're interested in getting more connected with Lit Illuminated, please check out RebeccaBeardsall.com. And thank you again for listening today. Yeah, and I mean, I feel like so much. There's one poem I do want to talk about, and then I'm going to open up for you to read. But like you mentioned in your notes, right? Like these poems are part of my attempt to picture what I could not picture about their lives, right? And this, again, those the echoes, the silences, all those spaces of trying to pull all of it together. Again, you do a beautiful job doing that. But it's on page 30, the poem's Remembrance. And this is one of those that it's short and sweet, but it was like really made me go that little like aha, like big pause, let me really think about this. That really, I love when poems do that to you, that it seems so obvious, but something on the page like that makes you like confronts what remembrance and remembering. Do you want to quick read that one for us?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. It is really short.
Yes.
Remembrance is different, I know, than remember. Somebody at a reading asked me what that difference was, which was really a nice question to think about, like, and I mean, I have been thinking about, but I do think those two words do feel, they're very different. It's a very different verb, and I don't know, I need to compare the actual definitions, but my personal definitions for feeling around those words is I feel like remembering is personal and interior, and like an interior activity, and remembrance is exterior and possibly kind of public and possibly kind of ritualistic. Remembrance feels like a community thing, and remembering feels like an individual thing, at least to me. But yeah, so that's my further reflection on that poem. But
yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that. I think some of this too is that you talk about going to the cemeteries and the gravestones. I mean, that's, to me, that's a remembrance, but not having the stories or the intimate knowledge for the remembering. I love remembrance. That poem has stuck with me since reading it. It's always those space that we talk about the play of words and what does it mean, and then that question being asked of you is, well, what does that mean? What do those terms mean to me, right? Like there is a definition in the dictionary, but what does it actually mean to me and how do I
Why do those
interpret that?
feel like related but very distinct
Yeah,
words? Like I don't mix those two
absolutely.
words up. They feel very different.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's why I love that one so much. So
Thank you.
I'm just going to offer it up. If there's any other poems that you want to read
Sure.
today or share with the audience, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, I'll read just two short ones, kind of in the vein of remembering and remembrance. I'll read one of the reenactment poems. This is in that third section that is a little bit more of a like confessional eye, but this poem is specifically about an activity called Trek, where a lot of Mormon youth kids dress up like pioneers and you're assigned a pioneer and you walk on the trail for several days with hand carts and stuff, which as an adult looking back, I was like, that's very interesting. And as someone who's really interested in folklore and ritual, I was like, that's very interesting. So I wrote a couple, I have two poems titled Reenactment, and this is the first one. Martin's Cove, Wyoming. We good girls pushed and pulled handcarts down one hill, up another, flour sack babies on our hips, long skirts matching pale bonnets we sewed with our mothers. Our mothers said, we pulled to honor the pioneer women who pulled after their men joined the Mormon battalion, our own congregation of boys. Waited on the last hill, wide brimmed hats in hands. When we stopped pulling, they offered each girl a little red drawstring bag, its belly full on a few red pebbles. For who can find a virtuous woman? Her price is far above rubies. And I'll just read one other short one. I had mentioned this earlier, but this was uh, the this is the dream poem that was kind of the first poem that sort of cracked things open for me where I was like, I think I could keep writing dream poems. And I did. But this one is about Martha, thinking about specifically, she was an English immigrant who had come to the United States and then been part of a handcart company to get to Utah and then ends up in Pinto and marrying her stepfather when she's 16. So this was that first poem about her. Martha dreams of green apples, of Bolton, of pissing her only dress when she couldn't stand in the boat's black belly, of the baby hardening in her black dress. Her mother breathes nearby, her baby loose in the bed. In her dreams, their husband stands an inch above the dirt. Thanks, Rebecca.
Yeah, thanks for sharing those with us. So my last question for you is about the heart of this podcast is also to help readers see how books allow that reflections to themselves, but also connect them to that larger community. So I'd love to hear in your words, like your wish or desire for this book to be a mirror of reflection or how you hope it's reaching people.
Yeah, I my hope would be for anybody who reads this book, just to maybe have it shift a little bit the ways we think about family stories, ancestral stories, where we come from kinds of stories, and the stories that aren't included in those and aren't told. And again, like I have a lot of sort of family history privilege. Like I have a lot of access to family history content, and even still, it is so generally male focused. And I think it's useful to think about even with people we've known, like even a grandmother, great grandmother, or a mother or a father, like people that we know, like we do feel like we have, you know, a lot of information and a lot of stories. And I think it's just always, I think it's important to also remember what doesn't get asked and what doesn't get told and what doesn't get shared is also still um, part of that history and part of what is inherited. Um, I think that historians are well aware, and we're all well aware that a lot of history doesn't get recorded. But I think it's a little bit different to try to think about that size of that, what we don't know, what we can't know. And so I think it can be, my hope is that it would just be sort of also a little bit of a useful exercise in thinking about our own histories a little bit differently, and specifically kind of marginalized histories. And I think there's a lot of things to write about other than ancestors, but I also think so much of writing about the personal is also a reflection of where we come from and who we come from, and I think maybe that's just my own personal feelings. Like I think that even just like the landscape where I grew up, I think is always going to be a huge part of who I am as a person and a writer. And I think that there's a lot of the personal in writing about those kinds of things too that can be really productive. So yeah, that's my 2 cents. But I think everybody has family folklore and culture and roots, and I think that there's a lot to write about. At least I've found that. I found that I had a lot of poems to write about it.
Absolutely. I love that. So thank you so much, Millie, for joining me today here on Illuminated. A reminder to our readers, you can pick up a copy. It's available wherever you buy books. These Saints Are Stones by Millie Tullis. A wonderful collection of poetry that like explores those silences, that ancestral connections, as well as, the way to think about how things echo through time. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Millie.
Thanks so much, Rebecca.